was at the end of the PowerPoint. There we go. All right. Nationalism. Yeah, you got a question?
I have there's another problem.
Nationalism. Let's talk about it. We've been talking about nationalism. This is, of course, supporting your nation, but even seeing yourself as a distinctive nationality, I guess we'd say, or group. And this group is normally identified by language, perhaps by some common culture. It doesn't always necessarily mean you have the same government. And we mentioned some examples, I think, last time about that, right? Like the Kurds. There are Kurds in Turkey, there are Kurds in Syria, there are Kurds in Iraq, but there is no Kurdish government, like Kurdistan or something. So they identify with each other, with their language and their culture. However, they are divided politically. This creates problems. But nationalism is often encouraged or brought out, even by colonialism. Colonialism is the idea, especially that the Europeans spread around the world, controlling much of the territory of the world, or at least large chunks of it. Especially the British create a huge empire, the British Empire. They even had a saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire. That means, they had territory all the way around the world, so that as the sun was perhaps setting on one part, it was rising on another part, right? So they had India, they had stuff in Asia, they had stuff in Africa, they had stuff in North and South America, so on. The French also have a lot of territory around the world. The Dutch. And later on, other countries will get involved as well, like the Germans, the Italians to some extent. Well, as colonialism spreads, it puts people under the authority of a different country. So, for example, in India, the British control India. So this tends to encourage people in India to want to be under their own government and have their own thing. So this kind of promotes nationalism in India, if you see what I'm talking about. Since you have an outside person giving you problems, right? Now, Africa is one of the locations where colonialism of Europe will expand and expand rapidly in the 19th century, until almost the entire continent is colonized by Europeans. One of the results of this is sometimes armed conflict. For example, in the southern part of Africa, the Europeans will end up fighting against the Zulus. The Zulus are known as great warriors. However, they do not have the weaponry that the Europeans have. You see in both these images spears, shields, maybe knives and clubs, that sort of thing. In other words, they don't have guns. They don't have gunpowder. They don't have that kind of weapons. But yet they go into battle. The Zulus are led by Shaka. That's the and eventually they are defeated, primarily because they are overwhelmed by their disadvantage of weapons. Eventually, a group known as Afrikaners will settle in South Africa. Afrikaners are of mostly Dutch descent. They're Dutch immigrants who sailed to South Africa, began to settle along the coast, pushing their way inland. So they set up territories or states like the Orange Free State or the South African Republic, sometimes called the Transvaal. This is happening back in the 1830s. So this is some of the earliest European, when when the Portuguese first went to Africa, and we talked a little bit about this, maybe not so much in this class, maybe it would have been in a previous class, but the Portuguese come, they're looking for spices, and they're finding routes, to China, to India, and that sort of thing. The Portuguese are not interested in taking over the territory of Africa. They are interested in having ports in Africa. And they will have contact on the coastal areas. They do get involved in slave trade, and they do get involved in that sort of thing. But it's not as though they're coming in to take possession of the entire continent. The first Europeans who are settling it in that way are these Afrikaners, these basically people of Dutch descent that settle in the south. But ironically, I suppose we might say ironically, as the slave trade is curtailed and eventually eliminated, you might think, well, when the slave trade is gone, then Africa will have less involvement of the Europeans. But in fact, just the opposite happens. As the slave trade declines, the Europeans' interest in or takeover of Africa increases because they are looking for other avenues of making money. If I can't make money from slaves, well, and they're also getting more familiar with Africa, and they find out, hey, they got gold in Africa, they've got diamonds in Africa, they've got copper mines in Africa, they can grow all kinds of crops, in Africa that we can't grow in Europe, coffee, and then we can bring plants from the New World, like the cocoa plants, the cacao plants, and make chocolate. You've probably heard of Belgium chocolate or Swiss chocolate. None of that stuff grows there. They're growing that in Africa, okay? So that now the number one producer of the elements that make chocolate are all coming out of Africa. They're not coming, well, I'll say all, but they're mostly coming from Africa now, rather than, say, Central America or South America. Okay? Well, anyway. So, what I mean by that is, when Africa in 1870, only 10% of it is controlled by Europeans. But as slave trade is ended, and it will begin to be ended, in the mid-19th century, in the mid-1800s, and then it will, in fact, the British outlaw it, so they won't deal in it. They won't deal in slave trade. They won't ship slaves or anything like that. And in fact, there is a movement within England to try to stop slavery. That movement is actually started by Christians. It's a Christian movement that gets political in England, and they push through legislation in England to bring it to an end, and so forth. There's other things that they do. And then eventually the slave trade is brought to an end. The last country, I believe, to give it up is the Dutch. Of course, they were one of the first countries to start with it. Not the first. Well, then once that happens, that is, once slave trade is in decline and then eventually eliminated, then the expansion inland takes place. The expansion into Africa, setting up colonies, so that, like I said, in 1870, 10%, by the time you get to like 1900, 30, 40 years later, like 90% of Africa is colonized. It's very rapid in, less than 40, like about 40 years. France, Britain, Spain, Portugal, all expanding. Belgium, all of them. Now, this brings up an interesting idea by this man. You see him sitting here in this painting. This is Rudyard Kipling. You might have heard of Rudyard Kipling, famous author. He wrote stories that perhaps you've heard of if you haven't heard of him. Disney has made him in it, like Jungle Book, I think was maybe one of his. Ricky, have you ever heard of Ricky Tikki Tavi? Have you heard that story? Did you read that story in school about a mongoose? It's in India. Well, Rudyard Kipling is British, but he grew up in India. So he identifies with India, and a lot of his stories are about living in India and that sort of thing. But Rudyard Kipling had a particular idea. He believed, and he was not the only one, but he was the one that gave it the thing that gets in most textbooks, which I think it's in your textbook still. It's called The White Man's Burden. The White Man's Burden. It's sort of a little essay, a little poem-like thing. And it basically is saying that the white man, that is the European, has a burden. What is their burden? Their burden is to carry civilization to the world, to bring institutions of, like hospitals, education, post offices, roads, all that kind of stuff, and to take it to the world. And then in his mind, that's going to make the world a better place. So he sees it as a positive thing. People today probably don't see it as a positive thing, right? But in fact, what Rudyard Kipling is trying to do is to get the Americans in on this, the United States. You say, you guys in the United States are not carrying the load that you should. You should be doing more to help us carry this burden. Us mostly meaning the British, but also other Europeans. That's called the white man's burden. Well, the idea here is they believe that the Europeans were more advanced in their society, in their culture, and therefore they had a duty to take that advanced things to the rest of the world and to, civilize other people. And this was appeal to the United States to take up that burden. You see the little cartoon in the upper left corner. It's hard to read, but that is the white man carrying the burden. The burden of, and I will say this, the British did, in many cases, invest in their colonies. They built roads. They built hospitals. They built schools. They built a postal system. They built train system, stuff like that. So this is what I guess I'd call infrastructure: roads, bridges, hospitals, and even educational, like schools. So this is what he's really talking about here. Is that those, you might put it a different way, might be less offensive, I guess, to us today, would be those who have should help those that don't have. And you should see it as your responsibility. If you have access to, good hospitals and roads and schools and all these other institutions of, that we just take for granted that they're there, right? Somebody's going to fix that road. There's going to be a hospital where I can go if I get sick. He's saying there's going to be a school for the children to go to. He's saying that is the burden of the Europeans to take that to the rest of the world. So that when they come there, you shouldn't just be, I guess you want to put it in a little more positive way, I suppose, you shouldn't just be taking, you should be giving. Now, of course, maybe the people there don't want what it is you want to give, right? That's what we might say today. But this is the way he looked at it. Okay, so he writes this, the white man's burden, and that then becomes a summary of this kind of thinking that becomes a sort of poster child for that kind of thinking, or what do you want to call it? It's the example. It's put in the textbooks. Now, this colonialism can be tied or is tied to imperialism. Colonialism means you're starting colonies, and if you have a colony, then you sort of have a mother country, and then the children country, if you want to think of it that way. You have like, say, England, and then you have India or someplace else. So you have this country that's sort of the one that's starting the colonies, and then you have the ones that are the colonies, right? But imperialism then is the idea that this home country, or the colonial power, is going to benefit from this relationship. That's part of the reason why they're doing it. And some might say the main reason why they're doing it is they benefit from it. They get something out of it. What do they get out of it? Mostly they're getting two things, I suppose we had to summarize it. It would be materials and then a market. So, for example, out of India, they can grow cotton. They can grow a lot of cotton. England cannot grow cotton. England has all the textile mills and all the apparatus to make clothing and weave and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of people don't want to wear wool all the time. They'd like to have cotton. Right? So you grow the cotton in India, you take the cotton, you ship it back to England. It goes through all the mills there, gives people work to do there. They take all the fibers of the cotton, they weave it into cloth, they take the cloth, they make it into a shirt or whatever else, and then you load those shirts back up. Not only do you have them in England, but then they take them around the world and sell them. So the colony also becomes the market. So then what you do is you bring the finished products back to India or wherever else, and you say, hey, here are these nice English shirts. Look how nice they are. And if you want to be, it became fashionable to look European. Yeah. Well, as you can see, I'm a slave to fashion. I follow all the trends. But, why do people, fashion? I mean, to me, fashion makes no sense. People just get, they see someone else doing something, wearing something, having something, and then they want to do that. And that becomes fashionable. How, why, for how long? I don't know. It doesn't last. Obviously, it doesn't last. So maybe it's that way for 6 months. Maybe it's a year. I don't know. Maybe it's a couple of years. And then suddenly, that's out. And we're on to something else. Well, this is what we see as being fashionable. It was fashionable to have, instead of having a shirt that was homemade, sort of homemade in India, you could tell, oh yeah, that's like local stuff. If you wanted to look wealthier, if you wanted to look more educated, if you wanted to look more with it, more stylish, more whatever, you'd want this nice tailored shirt from England. So that's what people started to wear. So they had a market. So say I'm using England as my example because they're probably one of the biggest ones and best known. But they're taking things like cotton from India and then they're bringing back finished things like pants and shirts and stuff like that, made in England. Okay? All right. See, I don't know what the fashion is. Well, I know what one of the fashions is. I don't know if it's still in or not, right? It's having like the torn up pants, especially blue jeans, seems to be. I don't know. Could it be other pants too? Well, you tell me. I don't know. But the pants with a lot of holes, like rips and torn. It looked like they're, they got them out of somebody, somebody's like beating these pants up, and then you wear them. And I imagine they buy them new that way, right? And they pay probably a lot of money for those pants. But you know, I spent a long time in Kentucky. I used to preach at a little church out in the country. And we had there what I called the church ladies. These are the ladies that were sort of the backbone of the church. They're in every church, but in this one, it was a small church. And I just, sometimes when I see the young ladies especially, I guess the guys wear them too, and I see those people coming with the ripped up pants, I imagine what the church ladies would say. It came to my mind the other day. They would say something like this, "Oh, bless her heart." Then they would say something like, "You know, why don't we take that girl and get her a decent pair of pants? Let's help her. You know, she can't even afford a good pair of pants." So, you know, they would probably want to take that person, take them to the store and get them a pair of pants that don't have any holes in it. That's the way they're thinking, right? I don't know. But by the way, when a church lady say, "Bless your heart," that's usually not a good thing. That's what I've found. You know, it's not an insult, but it's kind of like, oh, yeah, you just don't really know what's going on, do you? Now, sometimes the church ladies don't know what's going on, but don't tell them that. All right, so they have a market and they have supplies. Now, a lot of this gets fueled by Darwinism, so I want to talk about Darwinism for a few minutes. Here's a picture of Charles Darwin, a guy from England, right? A naturalist, we might call him, a scientist. He studies nature. You might call him a biologist, I don't know. But what he does is he has this idea, it's an idea to study life, to study especially nature. So he's able to get a hold of a ship called the Beagle. Her Majesty's ship, HMS Beagle, and he ends up sailing all the way around the world, actually, from England back to England. But what's most famous about his trip is going to the Galapagos Islands, which at that time were very remote. I mean, they're still remote, but more people go there, more people know about them now. At the time, they were, you know, a mysterious land. Nobody had been to these islands. And they're so remote that it was believed that whatever was there, you know, the birds, the nature, the things that were there, they sort of use it as a test to see how could they have gotten there and how did they develop. So that's what he's going to look at. And the thing that really captures his attention on these islands are the birds. Well, this is one of the things that he really writes about. They're finches. And in fact, they get called Darwin's finches. That's what some people call them. You can see down in the lower left corner of the screen, there are 4 drawings of 4 finch heads. Finch heads? Bird heads of finches. Finch heads. So there they are. Now notice the one on the left. Now, really what you want to notice is the beak. The beak is the most predominant thing there. The one on the left has a very thick beak. You see that? And the one on the right has a very narrow beak. Sort of elongated but narrow. These different beaks mean that these finches can eat different foods. The one on the left, if you see a bird like that, and there are other birds besides finches that have beak like that, that means they are seed eaters. They can break things open. Think of those beaks as like pliers or something. You know, they can smash the seed open and get to the part that's on the inside that they want to eat or will eat, right? The one on the right with the longer, narrower one, those are insect eaters. So they want a smaller, more precise thing because they're going after flies, I don't know, whatever's out there, insects they can get. If they have a big beak, you know, may not be able to maneuver it so easily. So Darwin comes up with this idea. He sees these finches. He believes that these finches came from a common ancestor. In other words, there was a one kind of finch originally on these islands, and then with time, let's say these 4 kinds of finches, there may have been more, but let's just say 4 kinds of finches develop, and that they developed so they'd have a different habitat, a different place where they'd want to live. Some on the ground, some in a bush, some up in a tree. Some are going to eat insects, some are going to eat like nuts and things, break things open. So that this one common ancestor changed into these 4 different kinds of finches. Okay? I'm trying to simplify, trying to make it fast. That's sort of what he says. And from that, and looking at other examples too, he concludes that, we had common ancestors and then we changed and adapted to our environment. Okay? So we're not here to talk about all the details of Darwinism, but I'm here to highlight a bit the influence of Darwinism on the way people were thinking in the 19th century. Okay? And they were thinking in this way. It comes to dominate, and still in many regards, it's sort of incorporated now into a lot of fields, this sort of evolutionary approach to things. It's not only in science, but in all kinds of fields. Education, psychology, and so forth. This is the idea that people develop, and as they develop, different ideas develop. So it had an immediate effect, and it has an influence even today. Those of you who study different areas, you might see it. You might notice it. Anybody here notice it in their field? Anybody talks about things evolving or things developing? Certainly in science they do. I think it may be in psychology, right? The idea that the mind evolves, like you got a little baby and then the baby mind gets, the baby mind changes. And as the baby mind changes into a human mind, matures, it kind of goes through different stages. Well, again, I'm not a psychologist, but this is the idea, right? That's following a model, a sort of pattern of evolution, of development. Well, we'll leave it at that. Now, the other thing I want to mention is it also has a political effect. It could have a scientific effect. We see that, obviously, in evolution, biology, and things like that. But what about politics? Something is going to develop that's called social Darwinism, and that's what I want to talk about here in a second. Let me just show you the route of HMS Beagle, Her Majesty's ship. I think it was a queen at the time Darwin sailed, or it might have been a king. I think he was Victorian. Well, anyway, HMS Beagle. You can see the journey out is the red line. You can see the red line starting in England, heading down to South America, and then going out to the Galapagos, and then from there sailing across towards New Zealand and Australia, and then past Madagascar, South Africa, and then eventually up north to England again. So he sails all around the world, but he goes to the Galapagos Islands, 600 miles off the coast of South America. So it's out there a ways. The idea is that they're isolated. So, a finch from South America probably not going to fly 600 miles out to these islands and then fly back. There's not going to be much interaction of, say, birds and mammals and reptiles, right? That means that these islands are fairly isolated from everything else. So that's why they were used to study. And they have a lot of diversity of life there. This is why people go now as tourists. There is ecotourism, or what you want to call it. They go there to see the tortoises and the birds and the other things that are there. Well, Darwin talked about natural selection. Natural selection. is you have this ancestral species or common ancestor. From that, then, there are certain pressures placed on the, let's say if it's a finch, a bird, to have enough food to eat. So if you got a lot of finches and they're all eating insects, well, that's going to run into problems. We're going to run out of insects. Or if they're all eating nuts. But if you've got some finches eating nuts and some eating insects and some that'll eat fruit and some that'll eat a mixture, now you can have a habitat that'll support more of these birds. So the pressure then, I guess you would say, the tendency will be to get these different kinds of birds, right, that are going to fit an ecological niche. And if they can't make it, then they'll go extinct. You see there, off to the right, in this little diagram, extinction. Not all of the species survive. But over time, there is divergence. There is diversity. So you go from one kind of finch to 4 or 5 different kinds of finches, each adapted for this. Okay, the thing that used to be in all the textbooks was this little diagram I put up here for you. It's about moths. I can remember this being in textbooks, having the moths. Now, by the way, maybe I shouldn't tell you this right now, as I'm going to use it as an example. It does make a good example. However, it was a false example because it turns out that the data doesn't really support it in this way. But it is a good example nonetheless. That's why I'm going to go ahead and use it. And then tell you that later on they took it out of the textbooks because they found they couldn't support it as much as they thought. Notice that you've got, it's hard to see here, but on the left, you've got a dark moth. And then up above you have a moth that's sort of gray. See? Okay. A speckled moth. And then a darker moth. And then notice on the right, now you can see the speckled moth, but the dark moth you can't see as well. Okay, this is to illustrate natural selection. And I think it does illustrate it well. Just this specific example they found wasn't really valid. But here's the idea. Let's say that you are the dark moth. Just imagine yourself a dark moth and your friend is the spotted moth. When a bird flies by, if you look at the light tree, the one on the left, if a bird's flying by, which moth is it more likely that they're going to eat? Yeah, the one that's most apparent, the dark one, right? So the dark moth would be selected naturally because it has a color that makes it stand out against its environment. Now, what they're saying is, the example, this is why they used it, is that, say, in England in the 19th century, they were burning a lot of coal. And as they burned the coal dust got in the atmosphere, and then the bark of the trees started getting darker from the coal dust. So now suddenly the darker moth has the advantage over the lighter speckled gray moth. So when the bird flies by, they're more likely to take the lighter moth. Well, this is the idea of selection. That something about you or something about that individual animal or whatever makes it stand out, makes it more vulnerable, whatever way you want to look at it, and it gets selected, say, as prey or for some other way, and then eventually it will decline. Okay? So in other words, what it's teaching is that the individual that is best suited to its environment has a better chance of survival into the next generation, to have little baby moths. So in scenario number 1 with the light tree, you're going to get a lot more of the peppered moth, the gray speckled moths, than you will the dark ones, and vice versa on the right. So you have to adapt to your environment. If your environment changes, you've got to change. If you don't change, then you will potentially go into extinction. This is the idea of Darwinism. Now, people are going to take that idea. We're going to get away from science, I guess, and now go to social science or political science. And the ideas of this guy right here, Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer is going to promote, he's not alone, but he is one of the main voices, promoting the idea of social Darwinism. And we're going to see that social Darwinism ends up fitting into imperialism or colonialism. And in a sense, that white man's burden that we talked about a few slides ago. I like this little diagram here. Let me put it up there. You see, you start off as a monkey. That's really not a monkey, it's a chimp. And then you get, sort of more human-like. And then, what's this? You get a computer and you turn back into a chimp. Well, anyway, I don't know. It's just a joke. It's sort of an evolutionary cartoon joke. By the way, did you hear we got monkeys in Florida now? There was a monkey attack just a week ago. Getting a lot more monkeys. I don't know. I'm kind of excited about it. I mean, I know it could be a problem. I don't want a monkey in my house. I don't want a monkey monkeying around with my stuff. But just the idea that we got monkeys. I know there's a whole island. There's an island north of Orlando. And that whole area has got a lot of monkeys because people had put the monkeys there. This is like 100 years ago. They wanted tourists. So they put monkeys on this island. And then they would bring people and they'd take boats around it. They could see the monkeys and stuff. Oh, isn't that nice? And they make money from it. But what they didn't know is that the monkeys were pretty good at escaping the island. And they went off into the other area. And then the people come and there's no monkeys. So they had to put more monkeys there. Now there's a lot of monkeys in that area. They were brought there, and aren't too many predators to a monkey, like a chimp. I don't know what kind of monkeys they are. But, because monkeys, actually, you don't want to mess with monkeys. I'm just saying, monkeys can get pretty violent, and some of them get pretty big. Can get to be 100 pounds or something. So if you see a monkey, just wave and keep moving. Anyway, monkeys. That's beside the point. We're not talking about monkeys. Don't get me talking about the monkeys. Okay, here we go. Herbert Spencer, 1820 to 1903. Now he's going to take this idea that Darwin made popular, and he's going to try to apply it now to countries, to cultures, to groups of people. His idea is that evolution doesn't just stop with birds and stuff like that. It's not only with people, but it's with complete societies. That some societies are young in their development and some are old in their development. And then eventually they'll die off and you get a new one. Well, so social Darwinism says that you should have the survival of the fittest applied to countries, to cultures. The strongest, therefore, are the fittest, and the strongest, therefore, should control and survive. So you can see how this is now going to take science, or at least a popular scientific idea, Darwinism, and it's now going to be applied and then used to kind of justify, if you will, the situation in the world. Why is Britain coming to dominate so much of the world? Because Britain is the strongest. And why are they the strongest? They are the most fit. And therefore, their culture is what is the best adapted to this world. So social Darwinism is going to reinforce, it's going to encourage imperialism. Because now you have a sort of intellectual rationale for what it is you're doing or what it is you want to do. Not only do you have sort of the moral obligation, the white man's burden, now you got science on your side because, really, the strongest should survive. If we don't have the strongest surviving, then overall things will decline. You make the world a better place? Let the strongest survive. Competition is good. And the most fit should be the ones that are in charge. Now, I'm not opposed to competition. In fact, I think competition can encourage people to do better. If there's no competition, I think people get a little lazy. That's just my idea. If we just say, oh yeah, well, all of you are going to get the same. Everything's going to be the same for everybody. There's no competition. Then I think people will kind of lower what they're doing. Because they'll say, why should I do more? I'm never going to get more. And the guy that's at the bottom says, well, why should I do any more? I'm going to get as much as the other guy. Right? Everything's going to be equal. But so competition kind of encourages development. It encourages that. So anyway, something to think about. Also, the idea here is that human societies are like organisms within the biological idea of Darwin and Darwinism. So therefore, human societies must adapt in order to survive. They must change, or they will go out of existence. So all of this then fits the idea, their idea, that Darwinism backs up imperialism. And then imperialism actually ends up benefiting not just, say, England, but also India. So one of the things that we see here that motivates imperialism or colonialism, the Europeans have certain goals, have certain ideas that they want to get across. One of them is actually evangelism, I guess we might call it, converting those who are heathen, those who are not Christian, bringing them the gospel message to a land that doesn't have it. So that's one of the things, and sometimes that doesn't get mentioned or just kind of gets brushed aside. But I think that was a rather large motivation, at least for a sizable number of Europeans. Secondly, of course, it was to create institutions. And by that I mean institutions like schools, hospitals, post offices, train station, a railroad company, that sort of thing. Another was to educate the local people, the native people. Teach them how to read, teach them how to write, teach them mathematics, at least basic mathematics. Since a lot of these schools were started by missions or missionaries, then you'll be teaching them about the Bible and stuff like that. What are they going to be reading? They'll be reading stories from the Bible, so forth. See how that might work together. So this is a way to educate people and to also train them. Well, there ends up being two kinds of rule of these colonies, two colonies. One is a direct rule where the Europeans are very hands-on. They run the colony, and then they have advisory council of local people, right? That's one. And then the other is indirect. This is where the Europeans, are there and sort of have veto power, can really influence things, but there are local people running it, but they're sort of running it under the supervision of the Europeans, if you will. So that has sometimes been called direct rule and indirect rule by the Europeans. Now, as this goes, there will be local people, we'll call them native people, they're native to that land, who will receive education. As they receive education, we're going to see the ones that receive the most education are actually going to be the ones who push eventually for the most independence or the most nationalism in their native land. I guess that makes sense. So you see this little pyramid I have up here. It's a pyramid of populations, and this could be in a variety of countries because it's imitated in a variety of locations, where the bulk of the people are farmers. You see, that's what that bottom part, sort of brownish orange color. That's sort of the backbone of it, the agriculture, raising of crops and animals and that sort of thing. The yellow layer, much smaller, are the monks, the merchants. Those are sort of local leaders. And then at the very top, that little red pyramid at the top, is English-speaking natives. Now, of course, this assumes it's a British colony. But if you are a local person, and if you know how to speak English, if you're educated in that way, this puts you at the very top of the society because you are of value to the British. You're of great value to the British, let's say. But you're also of value to your own culture. You can be a liaison between the British and them. You can translate things back and forth. And then you are often the ones who will become the leaders. Okay? So this is repeated in India, Egypt, Indochina, and so forth. That normally the people who are wealthy once the British or the Europeans show up, they're the ones who end up, at that top part up there, the red pyramid. They're the ones who have the education and the money for the training. These wealthy natives make sure that their children are well educated as well. They're training them for what? They're training them to work within the government system that the colonial power has brought. So if it's the British, then you want to learn English as well as a British, and you want to speak it in a way that the British do not have any trouble understanding it. And you want to know the British ways, tea time and the way to dress and know about cricket and all these other kinds of things. In fact, some of these, some of the people in the colonies, let's just put it this way, not only the educated natives, but the British themselves who are stationed there, actually become sort of hyper-British, if you know what I'm talking about. They get extra Britified. I don't think that's a word. But in other words, they want to do things even more British than the British would do it because they want to make sure they don't lose their Britishness. Does that make sense? So in other words, they become very fastidious about having tea time, and it has to be done just in the right way and just with the right kind of tea and just this and that, right? They have to make sure they wear the right kind of clothing at the right time. They have to make sure they play cricket on the right days with the right rules, and on and on and on. You see what I'm saying? They become sort of super British in their approach, even more so than a lot of people back in England would be, to sort of make up for the fact that they're not there. And so too then these, upper native people begin to learn this sort of hyper-British stuff too, because they feel this is the only way they're really going to fit in, all right? But the number one way, of course, is the language. Speak English, and to speak it in a British way. Well, if you've ever called tech support for anything, you'll know what I'm talking about. There are people who speak English, and I got no idea what they're saying a lot of the time. You know what I'm talking about? I'll say, I'm sorry. I'm not quite sure what you said there. I'm not quite sure what you mean. Anyway. It kind of reminds me too, I go to the Middle East. I've gone to the Middle East a lot. And years ago, I went to Jordan, the country of Jordan. And I met this local guy. He was probably 15, 16. And he began talking to us, because we were, of course, mostly Americans. And he had this very thick British accent. He'd say, "Cheerio, how are you?" He was doing all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, wow, really? I thought he was like putting on an, no, he said, that's how he learned his English. I said, well, you speak very fine English. Oh, thank you very much, sir. That kind of thing. And I said, well, where'd you learn it? He says, I learned it from the BBC. He listened to the BBC radio, and they had English lessons. And so they taught him the proper way to speak, right? And so he wanted to practice that on us. But of course, we were Americans, so it didn't really count, right? We don't speak right, according to the British. I go to England. I was in England last summer working on this dig, right? So I spent a couple of weeks every day with pretty much all British people. There was like one other American there. And so I asked them to teach me British stuff, And so they would try to teach me some slang and some things like that, and how to say certain things. And it was interesting. Well, a lot of these native people would be sent off, the wealthy ones, the ones that wanted the proper education. They would actually send them, say, to England to study. Or if it was French colony, to France, to Paris or something. So they'd go to Oxford or Cambridge or the Sorbonne in Paris. And of course, this wasn't available to the common people, but this would be kind of the upper crust of the local population. They would go off and learn. I mean, they would be in Oxford and they'd be in Cambridge, and then they would go back to India or wherever. And of course, they've been introduced to all this British stuff. And of course, in a way, it helps them out back home. But it becomes, in a way, frustrating, because they actually see how they will never really be British. I mean, they're never really going to be accepted as British, no matter how sort of British they become. Does that make sense? Anyway, but for the common folk, there were few choices. They didn't have much money. There weren't many schools. There was no, for most of them, there was no public education, like say we have here in the United States, where basically you're forced to go to school. By the government, you're forced to go to school until you're what? Depends on the state, 15, 16, something like that. Isn't that what it is? And then you can be a dropout. Okay. But it's free. You go to school, you don't pay. You don't pay for, well, almost anything, right? They bring a bus around and pick you up. They don't charge you. They take you to a school, and the school's heated and it's got stuff in it, and you don't pay for any of that. You don't pay the salaries of the teachers. You don't pay for anything. You just show up and theoretically be educated. Okay? Well, for these people, they didn't have that option. For example, in Vietnam in 1917, about 100 years ago, there were only 3,000 towns out of the 23,000 towns that had a public school. So that means in 20,000 of those towns, there was no school. Where are you going to go to school? Well, typically the only place to go, if you were not wealthy, about the only thing you could hope for your child to be educated was to send them to a mission school. Send them to a mission school. This is a school started by a missionary or a mission activity. So they come, and one typical things that missionaries will set up are schools and maybe healthcare, hospitals, that sort of thing, clinics. And so if you could get your child into that school, you don't pay, it's free. But of course, along the way, you're being educated in Christianity and things like that. But you learn how to speak, you learn the language, you learn the history and that sort of thing. This would be a chance for a poor child, a child without a family that didn't have much money, for their child perhaps to get ahead. If they could get this education, then perhaps they could have a different life. And so I don't think I can overemphasize how important these educational institutions were. Now, they became vehicles of, you might say, of colonialism, because the education they're receiving is Western education. They're learning English, they're learning how to speak English, they're learning about British history or whatever, they're learning all this sorts of things, but it also gives that child an opportunity. Well, the British, let's say in India, if we just do a little outline of some of that, the British take Burma. Burma is in the north and east part of India. Take that in the 1820s. They did this primarily because they had India and they wanted this territory so they could get land routes to China. So I guess what I'm saying is the British being in India led to the British wanting to control other areas. And also conflict. Have you ever played a game called Risk? You ever heard of the game called Risk? Some of you played that game? A few of you. What's that?
Every Thanksgiving or so, my uncle and his children come over and we all play Risk.
You play Risk. Okay. So it's a map of the whole world, right? Depending on how many people you got, you sort of divide, you get, I don't know how many the maximum, maybe 6, 4, 6, something like that. And so then you get, through chance, you kind of get countries to start off with, but then what you have to do, you have to build up your resources, and then basically your idea is to take over the whole world. So that sometimes you're only interested in the game of Risk, you're only interested in certain countries because they are gateways to other countries, right? Like there's one that goes from Brazil to somewhere in Africa, right? And then there's one from, the good place to start is Australia, because there's only one way onto Australia, as I remember it, and that goes to Southeast Asia. So if you can build stuff up in Australia, you only got to worry about people coming at you one way. Then you can advance out of there. But wherever you are, you're supposed to advance out. So basically what happens here with these new colonies come because they protect other colonies. So I think the game of Risk is pretty good for that. You advance to other places because you want to guard the place you are. You want to get to the place you want to be, and you got to have an avenue to get there. And so that's what happens. So were the British really interested in Burma? Not really. But they were interested in Burma because it connected India and China. Gave them a gateway in. Afghanistan. Why was Afghanistan important? Why has there been so many battles there? We've been fighting there. The British fought there. The Russians fought there. There's been a lot of people fighting there. And by the way, I could just give you a summary of how it works out. Not well. For any of the people who didn't work out well for the British, didn't work out well for the Russians. I don't think it worked out that well for us or anyone else. So the British fight in Afghanistan. Why? They wanted to set up a buffer to keep the Russians out of India. But it didn't work too well for them. Well, we have to move on. Now I'm going to mention what I'm going to call benefits of colonization. I know this would be strange because most people would never talk about colonization having any benefits. But I do think it has some. Obviously, there are a lot of downsides, but there might be a few positives. One of them is stability. If you have a stable government, even if it's not the best government, if it's stable, it can make life more livable for you. At least you know what to expect. And I think colonization did bring a stability to the colony for the most part. Increased education. I do think that colonization, for the most part, especially in the British ones, they were pretty good about building schools and training people, at least in basic reading, arithmetic, writing, that sort of thing. Sometimes inhumane practices can be ended. Now, some people say, well, you shouldn't touch the local culture. Leave it the way it is. It's very pristine. The British didn't follow that. Certainly in the case, and you might say, well, maybe in this case it wasn't a bad idea. In India, they had the practice of sati. S-A-T-I, sati. Sati, you know, there was within the culture of India the idea that the wife, of course, was married to the husband, but that the wife should not remarry. And in fact, there was a lot of pressure on the woman, sometimes more than pressure, that if the husband died, that she should die. The common practice in India was to burn the body of the deceased, right? A funeral pyre. And the widow, in her grief, of course, would jump onto the funeral pyre, holding on to her deceased husband, and they would be burned up to, it's very romantic, isn't it? They'd be burned up together to spend eternity together. Well, part of the problem was sometimes in the widow's grief, she forgot to jump onto the funeral pyre and other people would throw her there. That's what sati is about. That's what the British tried to end. And also the laws that pretty much made it illegal for a widow to remarry. Also, the property laws were such that the children, especially the sons, got all the property. So when the husband died, the wife got nothing. It went to the children, went to the sons. And then a lot of times the sons didn't want their mom around because they'd have to take care of her. And she couldn't marry anybody else because that was against the law. And so there was a lot of pressure. Just join dad. The British tried to put an end to that. It was a very tough thing to end. I don't know if it still goes on at all now, but they tried to make it legal for widows to get remarried. Also to end the thuga. This is where we get our word thug. These are basically bandits, criminals, robbers, whatever. They would go out along roads. They would catch travelers. You know, travelers are very vulnerable. They don't know their way. They're usually carrying money or other valuables. Other benefits, I think I would put this under the area of infrastructure. Railroads, roads, telegraphs, postal service, along with that, bridges and other things. Also, setting up a kind of a court system that was very westernized. British penal code. Certain things are illegal, certain set penalties for things. Sometimes to be considered less harsh than others. Health and sanitation improved, that is, more hospitals, more clinics, more doctors, maybe sewer lines or practices of hygiene improved. Now this does cost the British, but of course, to build the infrastructure, but obviously colonialism cost the local people an awful lot as well. British textiles certainly damaged the local economy, certainly the textile economy, because everybody wants to buy the British stuff and they don't want to buy the local stuff anymore. Here's another thing that happens in a lot of British colonies. It's called the Zamindar system. This is basically a way to bring stability for the British to the area. Let's say, for example, if somebody couldn't pay their taxes, their land taxes, what the British would do would be to take that land away from those people and give it to wealthy people, wealthy local people who could pay the taxes. This way the British get their taxes paid, and the land is more productive as they see it. And also it invests the wealthy people more into making sure the country stays viable, because they have a lot to lose if it doesn't. So this happened especially in India, but also in other places. And the gentry, the gentry are those who are landowners, sort of the wealthy landowners, benefit from this system. One thing the British did not do was invest a lot of money in industrialization, say in India, because that would cost a lot and they would sort of lose control of it, and there wasn't a lot of local capital to pay for it. And the British didn't want to pump a lot of money into, say, India, because they were afraid they would end up losing that money in the end if something happened. They couldn't control what would happen. Just like if you took your money, if you had $1 million and you invested in a place like, I don't know, some country that is far away, and the government might change and the rules might change, you might make a lot of money, but you might also, it's very risky. You'd rather not invest your own money in it, but find a way to manage it to make money. Well, we're out of time, so we'll leave it there for today. I've decided to try to finish this now. We talked about the Zamindar system and how this was going to benefit the gentry of India as well as the British. Other ideas that happen at the same time, we've been talking about India, we've been focusing on Britain and on India. And we also see the same kind of thing happening, Africa, Southeast Asia, and so forth, where actually those who are educated, the most educated native elites, are the ones who begin to demand more local rule and more democracy. Likewise, we see that romanticism and nationalism create a growing push for local rule and to get rid of the colonial powers. This will lead to resistance all around. I want to shift gears here and talk for a bit about Hegel and his ideas about history. Hegel is a German who lives in Germany in the late 1700s, 18th century, and up to 1831. So he's a Prussian. The Prussians are in the northern part of Germany. And he comes at history from the point of view of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. He saw history as a line. He saw history as having a beginning point and an ending point. It was moving towards that ending point. He believed that God was directing it through a force called the dialectic, and that God was using the dialectic and using history then to bring things to pass as he would want them to come to pass. This is interesting, and it was very popular. At universities, there were young Hegelian societies where Hegel his ideas were espoused. So the dialectic was driven by conflict. So this is basically warfare. And God established this system according to Hegel, and used very important people, world historic individuals will lead things forward. People like Alexander the Great, perhaps Julius Caesar, Napoleon, and others. But the idea here is that God is going to continue to move history forward. So I have this little diagram here just to try to illustrate it. The way things are is the thesis. That's the way things are right now. Rising up against that is the antithesis or antithesis. This is a kind of response to the way things are and a call for change. That eventually leads to a synthesis, but only after conflict, which in this case would be warfare between these systems, armed conflict of various kinds, which leads to a new system, the synthesis. The synthesis becomes the new thesis. The thesis then has rising up against it the antithesis. And this continues on in a chain of events from the beginning of history to the end. So this was Hegel's idea. Now, part of the reason why Hegel was so important is because Hegel inspires the teachings of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, you probably have heard of, the founder of Marxism. He flips Hegel on its head. He removes God from the picture, and he basically will say that the conflict instead of warfare is revolution. So, you have to know that Karl Marx was Jewish. His family was Jewish. They lived in Germany, in Trier, Germany. He had joined the Young Hegelian Society, and he had become a radical journalist who wanted to push for revolution, and that this revolution then would push forward, in his idea, the dialectic which bring about change. So Marxism is a growing force in the 19th century. You see Karl Marx's date here, 1818 to 1883. Now, Marx's friend, pictured here, is Friedrich Engels. This is really the person who kind of bankrolled Marx and Engels. But Marx, his friend Engels, had the money. He got it from his father. Even though he didn't believe in what his father was doing, he was willing to take his money. Together, they write a manifesto, a document. It's not very long, really. You could probably read it in less than an hour. It's called the Communist Manifesto of 1848. And this was written in response to many of those revolutions of 1848 we talked about before, uprisings all across Europe. And so Marx and Engels thought this was the perfect time to release their ideas in this Communist Manifesto. What are their ideas? Well, they're there in the Communist Manifesto. They're more fully delivered in Marx's main work, Das Kapital, in 1867. And he also calls for a first international in 1867 of the workers, where basically he's focusing on the idea that you shouldn't have nationalism. This is what's going to make it a tough sell for some. You don't have nationalism. You should see yourselves as being related to the people who do the similar kind of work as you, people in the same station of life. He said, workers of the world, to unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. He believed that capitalism was enslaving people, that capitalism was holding people in bondage, and that if the workers would unite, workers of France and Germany and England and so forth, would not be aligned with their nation, but would be aligned with other workers. And he believed that would eventually happen. They would have a massive revolution across the world, and then we would see workers of the world uniting and setting up a brand new kind of government, a brand new kind of approach. Marx, while Hegel believed in God, Marx felt that religion was negative. In fact, he called it the opium of the masses. It drugged people into waiting for the next life to get justice, waiting for the next life for these things. So you see these two guys here are smoking opium. They don't really care about anything else. Why? All they want is more opium. And so once they get it, They don't worry about what's going on. This is the way Marx viewed religion, that it drugged people and that it kept them from looking at things the way that they should. So he believed that that surplus value was added by the workers. So in other words, if somebody takes wood and they make it into a table and they sell it, they charge more than what the wood would have been, right, for the table or the chairs or whatever. The person who does that will get that money. But if you go into a factory and you take that, whatever the goods are that you're making, and then you sell it, you charge more for it. That's what we would call profit. Profit is what Karl Marx would call surplus value. And he would say that doesn't come for free. It comes from the labor of the workers. Therefore, the workers are the ones having their items stolen from them, their work stolen from them, and that's the profit of the guy that owns the factory. So, as we see here, Karl Marx then would say that there would eventually be an uprising. And they use these terms that became popular during the French Revolution. The bourgeois are the ones who own the factories, are sort of the wealthy. The proletariat are the workers. And that eventually those workers would have conflict with one another, rise up against the bourgeois and take control and set up a whole new government, set up a whole new way of doing things. All right, we'll leave it there for now.